because it only takes one potential claim situation where if you are doing professional photography, even if it's just for one day, then that puts your home at risk and your personal assets.
Welcome to Off the Memory Card, the podcast where photographers talk about everything but taking photos, because photography is only 10% photos and 90% building a life and business you love. I'm Kathleen Burns. Let's dive in. Welcome to Off the Memory Card. I'm Kathleen. Today I am joined by the fabulous Danielle Ellis, the owner of Ellis Insurance Agency, and we are talking about all things insurance in the photography world. Before we dive into that, though, Danielle, tell us a little bit about yourself and your business.
Thanks, Kathleen. So I'm an entrepreneur as well and a small business owner. I'm a mom of 6 kids and 4 at home, and been doing insurance now for probably close to 20 years.
It's actually in your blood.
Yeah, it is. It is. My dad started our agency back in the 80s, and I purchased it from him in 2020. And so we've been growing quite a bit since then, but especially with commercial insurance.
All right. So she definitely knows her stuff. And you do work with a lot of creatives like photographers.
I do.
I think the thing with photography is, unfortunately, a lot of them don't have insurance. And I'm kind of speaking from experience, the beginning stages of my business, I honestly did not even think about it till I purchased our first studio. And by that time, I was 5 years in. So definitely not shaming any photographers who are in that beginning stage who don't have insurance, but it's so necessary. Mm-hmm. There are other reasons, it's overwhelming. They don't know who to talk to, what to ask. So that's what this episode is all about. Hopefully you can answer all these questions for us. Let's start by talking a little bit about, I guess, the different types of insurance that a photographer might need, because it's not a one size fits all.
It's not. And of course, as you mentioned, if you have a studio, then you're going to need property insurance. So that's when a lot of people are triggered to think about it. I work with a lot of creative people, and their brains are beautiful, but it works differently. They don't think about the nuts and bolts and the paperwork and the contracts. And now in the advent too of AI and ChatGPT, they're, throwing stuff together, making contracts, and may miss a few things. And insurance being one of those. So the different types of insurance that photographers need: property insurance if they've got a studio. They need general liability insurance, which can cover camera gear as part of that. It's called a BOP policy or a business owner's policy, but especially professional liability insurance. Professional liability covers mistakes. It covers errors. I want to talk a little bit more about that. But those are the 3 types: property insurance, general liability insurance, and professional liability insurance, and workers' compensation if they have any employees. Mm-hmm. But if they don't have any employees, then that's not a need for just a simple, set up photography business or startup.
Okay, so if there's someone who just started their photography business, where should they start on the topic of insurance?
Well, the first thing they need to know about is their camera. And that's usually one of the first purchases is they get a really nice camera and they see that they're good at it and they start taking pictures. So one of the questions that I would ask is, what's the value of your camera? What's the serial number of it? What's the serial number of your lenses? Like, what is your setup? And I list the actual brand name, the serial number of their lenses, things like that, to make sure that camera is properly covered. And it's covered on something called an inland marine form, which means that if they take it with them to go and get pictures off-site, which is kind of like y'all's whole job, then they're going to get the coverage for their camera if it's stolen, if it's damaged, if it's dropped, or the lens or any part of that camera or lighting setup is dropped or damaged or stolen. Not just at their home or at their studio or whatever. So if they're working out of their house, they're going to need business insurance. Mm-hmm. One of the things that a lot of photographers think is that they've got homeowners insurance. Like, I'm good. Yeah. But here's the thing. Homeowners insurance doesn't cover you if you've got business pursuits. And insurance claims adjusters are detectives. Like, they will look at your Facebook, they will look at your social media, they'll say, okay, are you marketing that you're a photographer, that you're in business, that you're making money, you're advertising services? And if they see that you're advertising services, let's say you had a house fire and your camera was damaged in the house fire, you're not going to be able to say, oh, I was just, using that for photos of my kids. Sorry, no, you were advertising that you're a photographer, so we're not going to pay for any of your business gear if it's damaged when you're advertising as a photographer. That requires business insurance. So homeowners is not going to cover your camera. And it's certainly not for liability either.
Okay, so when is the point where, it's starting to transition from hobby to this is how I make a living? At what point do we stop and say, this is the time to get insurance?
My answer would be when you're charging money for the service. If you are taking photos for a friend's birthday party and you're doing it, just because you love your friend, no, you don't need business insurance. But when people start to pay you, that's when it becomes a business. And that is when you've outgrown your homeowner's insurance at that point because it's no longer a hobby.
So you say when you start making money, that's the point you need to start looking into insurance. What if someone says, well, I only shoot a few sessions a year?
Well, if you're getting paid for those sessions, then that creates the risk because it only takes one potential claim situation where if you are doing professional photography, even if it's just for one day, then that puts your home at risk and your personal assets if your hobby that you're financially benefiting from creates an insurance claim situation.
So basically the first penny you're making, it's time to look into insurance.
Yes.
Okay. So this is something I feel like I've always kind of taken for granted because ever since I got insurance with you, I just know that you're taking care of me. I'm like, oh, Danielle's going to tell me this is what I need. And I'm like, okay. But I feel like not everyone out there has a Danielle looking out for them. So let's dive a little deeper into like these types of insurance. Like what is the difference between general and professional?
Great question. So general liability, you can think of that as physical damage mostly. So if you're let's talk about some claims examples potentially.
Okay.
So if you're on site and someone trips over your light stand and becomes injured, that's a general liability claim. That was premises liability, which is part of a general liability insurance policy. You're liable for that if you didn't set up your light stand properly, you left it laying on the ground, so your general liability policy would pay for their medical benefits. And also it could be accidental copyright infringement. Say you published something, you didn't realize another photographer had done that before. And, now you're being sued. Copyright infringement were unintentional, like that's a general liability insurance claim. Professional liability, which I think is photography essential, covers things like lost photos, covers things like if you give a client the wrong advice, say you damage the photos with filters, things like that, that the client's unhappy with the work. It's your workmanship, it's your work product. But especially when it comes to lost photos, in my opinion, that's a photographer's greatest risk. Like what happens, and I think that's why you all try to deliver galleries so quickly. Like, oh, done, awesome, But lost photos is a big part of professional liability.
Okay, so if you are in the situation where you are a photographer and you're making money, do you feel like it's important to have both of those in place?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even more important than the camera equipment itself, because you can replace a camera a lot easier than you can pay out thousands of dollars in a potential insurance claim.
I actually read somewhere recently that a photographer will pay insurance for their 85 millimeter before they will even think about getting like business insurance.
In my experience, that is the case.
Have you seen a lot of issues with photographers needing insurance?
Yes. And it's mostly horror stories where they've told me like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have had the coverage. Are you serious, Danielle? Like lost photos coverage is only $2 a year? And I'm like, yes, it really is $2 a year.
Note of that, $2 a year.
Now you can't buy it by itself. Let me throw that out there.
Okay,
but
good to know.
$2 a year to add to a photography general and general and professional insurance policy. It's $2 a year to add that to the setup. So in general, a startup photographer who doesn't have a studio, who's just wanting to insure their camera and have both of these types of liability, is looking at about $800 a year. One of my favorite carriers that I go through is the Hartford for photographers because the professional liability enhancements are so strong with Hartford. You can schedule each of their lenses because they're going to interchange. They've got gears. I have one photographer insured that he's a gear junkie. He has like hundreds of thousands of dollars a gear, I would say. And, we insure it all to where it can leave sight. I'm asking specific questions like how many thousands of dollars do you leave your studio with at any given time? Mm-hmm. And it could be, $10, $20, $30,000 of gear, depending on the setup, because he's doing a lot of event photography. And so knowing that helps me to create and set his limits to where it can leave this much can leave the studio with him at any given time. because nobody's usually taking their whole setup.
Right.
So, but a startup photographer, they're looking at about $800 a year, $802 a year. If you want lost photo coverage, is pretty affordable.
And honestly, that's 2 or 3 sessions. So if this is what you are doing for a living and you're serious about it and you really want to protect yourself, that's really kind of a drop in the bucket. Like, yeah, almost a no-brainer.
Yeah. But monthly payment options though, too. You don't pay that all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. We have mentioned a little bit about studios and having that property insurance. Let's dig a little deeper into that. Exactly like what you need for a studio. Also, I want to go into renting studios. That's a huge thing in the industry right now. So many photographers out there are renting their spaces to other photographers who, can't afford a studio or doesn't need it enough to have their own. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Great. And you bring up a great point too, because someone who is doing maybe 3 or 4 sessions a year, there are options for them if they really don't want to do any more. They have one day a year where their thing is Easter minis, and that's all they do is Easter minis, for their church or something. So there's some other options that they could do. So if someone owns a studio, it's very important that you make sure that everybody who you sublease a portion of your studio to has their own business insurance. Otherwise, it all falls to you, and you're responsible for their work product and for their clients coming on site, and whatever they may do, it falls to you because you rented the space. So it's important that any photographers that you're subleasing to have their own insurance. Now, they say, I'm too small, this isn't worth it to me, I'm not going to rent your studio space. They could purchase a one-day insurance policy. If that's all they'll ever do is 1 session a year and they're renting a studio space, they could get event insurance with there's event insurance and there's business event insurance, like for a 1-day policy or a 3-day policy or something like that. That if they've got an agency who specializes in commercial insurance, most likely they've got a carrier that specializes in short-term insurance. But at some point, the more sessions that you're doing, you might be able to get something like that for $100 or $200, something to that effect. But the more sessions that you do, the more it makes sense to have an annualized policy, like I was just describing. So at some point you'll meet that threshold.
So if someone is in that situation in the beginning stages, do they just need to reach out to a local insurance agency? I know that sounds like such a no-brainer, but it is a question that people ask. Is that where they start? Just start local, like go to, someone, an insurance agent you go to church with,
Well, so no,
because
there are insurance agents who, you might know personally who go to church with, things like that. They have the same license that a commercial insurance agent like I have does, but they may not specialize in commercial insurance. I see it a lot. And I find mistakes on those policies because they didn't understand what the person was truly doing and the exposures. Like they're taking their gear with them, for instance. That's a different coverage than if they're parked at the studio and only doing studio sessions. Or they're hosting a bridal party and those people might bring alcohol to the studio session and enjoy a little champagne while they're taking their photos and their selfies or whatever. A selfie studio requires different photography insurance than would someone who's going off site. There are slightly different coverages that we have to make sure that we put in place. So no, an insurance agent that you go to church with, unless they're a commercial insurance agent and have experience with photographers, they may not know all the different coverages that need to break down. So what I would do in your local area, I would look up insurance agencies with online reviews for strong experience in commercial insurance. And I would especially ask them specifically if they have the Hartford as a carrier, because it's pretty easy to get an annual policy with them. We also use Thimble, and that's good for short-term business insurance policies. So both of those are great carriers that I have in my office. And you don't necessarily have to have someone local. Like if you're listening to this from, California or wherever, there are insurance agencies who specialize in commercial insurance that may not be in your backyard, but they may be licensed in your state. Like my agency, for instance, we're licensed in West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, North and South Carolina, so technically I could insure a photographer in any of those states with the expertise that I have. But if someone has a relationship, with a local insurance agency that they trust, I would just make sure that person has a lot of experience with commercial. You can interview your insurance agent just like you would for anybody else you're hiring for a job. So ask the questions, tell me about your commercial insurance experience, tell me about what coverages a photographer needs. This is the information age. I mean, you could literally pull up ChatGPT and ask it anything about photography insurance. And I'll point out if there's any errors. If y'all want to email me, I'm happy to do that. But generally, it's going to flood you with a bunch of insurance questions and information to ask to interview your potential insurance agent and make sure they're the right fit for you.
Yeah, and that's great advice. Make sure they do commercial. And I also like the tip about using Hartford. I assume that's what I have. See, I tell you, I don't even know these things because I just trust you to take care of me. When I bought this current studio that we're in, I messaged Danielle and told her some of the things I wanted to do. She took me out to lunch, picked my brain about all of the things, and went back to her agency, had a meeting with other agents, made sure I was covered. I love that. I wish everyone had someone like you in their lives, but definitely find someone who works with commercial insurance. Mm-hmm. Great advice. One more type of insurance for photographers that we want to touch on before we move on is something a lot of photographers don't necessarily think about, especially in those early stages, but is important. So tell us a little bit about that.
So that would be cyber liability. And this really comes into play if you're storing clients' data. So if you have contracts where you're getting clients' names, addresses, especially any personal information, birth dates, socials, things like that, payment information, if these are things that you're storing, then you could be in a cyber liability situation. So, and I want to differentiate too between cyber liability and data compromise. So data compromise is the accidental leaking of customers' information, could be names and addresses. And that's an add-on to a general liability insurance policy. And what that essentially covers is the cost of notifying them, which can be thousands. If you've got a lot of customers, you've got to mail them all a letter and say, hey, your information was compromised. Here's some potential, credit monitoring services. We're sorry. All of these people get a letter. It's almost becoming the norm these days. I've gotten a couple of myself.
I feel like I have as well, yeah.
Yeah, but the cost of mailing all those out to meet the legal requirements is expensive. So that's why data compromise is helpful. It could be leaving papers on a desk. That's also a data compromise claim. But cyber liability is more of a newer thing, and it is the malicious hacking of someone's data. So someone in Nigeria or wherever is trying to get your customer information. The less customer information that you store, obviously, is going to reduce your risk in itself. But cyber liability insurance can be pretty expensive. So not everyone needs it. I want to throw that out there. But if you're storing customer data, then cyber liability coverage can protect that for your business. And it usually runs around $3,000 to $4,000 a year. It's based on how many computers you have, how many users, how many employees, and what your total annual revenues are. So the price can vary a bit.
Definitely something to keep in mind and think about, especially if you're going down that road.
Right. And to understand how to set yourself up for information that you don't want to store.
Okay, great. All right, so now let's move into a little bit of the doom and gloom here of what could potentially happen if you do not have insurance. And I'm not even sure where to start on this.
Well, if you're charging for your services and there's a potential claim, especially an injury claim, personal injury claim, almost guarantee someone is going to sue. And if they do sue you, then you don't have business insurance, then you're more than likely going to be personally responsible. I've heard the argument, oh, but I have an LLC. The most they can get is my assets of my LLC. But here's the thing that I just learned recently from an attorney is that if you mix your business and personal assets, say you use your business card to buy personal groceries and you categorize that as owner's pay and personal expenses, or vice versa, buy photography equipment with your personal account and then reimburse yourself later, which a lot of sole proprietors are doing.
Oh, I've done it for sure.
I've used the wrong card and I've done it before, don't tell my CPA. But stuff like this happens a lot. If you mix your business and personal assets, then it can bring you personally liable, especially if you're intentionally mixing your business and personal assets and treating it casually, treating the lines casually, then that attorney will argue in court that they have the right to sue you personally for your personal and business pursuits.
So worst case scenario here,
you could lose your house. You could lose what's in your bank account. You could have your paychecks at your day job garnished for years to come by a judgment order if you have no insurance.
That's been pretty serious stuff that no one even thinks about. So
yeah,
thank you for shedding some light on that. I had no idea. Say it's not necessarily someone injured, but say the loss of photos? What's worst case scenario in that situation?
So that can pay to recreate some of the photos. Obviously, that's not going to help if it's a wedding or something like that.
Right.
But
Those moments they only happen once.
Right. But it can offer someone a settlement, because that's what insurance does. When there's no way to make someone whole, then they settle. And usually that happens out of court. So the lost photo coverage can at least pay them thousands of dollars, depending on the value. I mean, obviously a reimbursement of the service fees that photographer charged, and also a settlement fee for their compensation for that they were injured by missing their photos.
Now let's kind of transition into, how to avoid these risks in the first place. And this is something I can kind of touch on as well. Making sure you have strong contracts in place. Is there anything specific that, you think we should definitely have in these contracts that would help prevent a liability claim?
Yes. So anybody can sue anyone for anything, but
right.
If you have a solid contract and you hold your partners accountable to the same. So if you're at a venue, you need to make sure that venue has insurance. And that not necessarily that you're named as an additional insured on their policy. More than likely it goes the other way. They're going to want you to name them as an additional insured on your policy in case you cause damage to their facilities, or in case, an injury results from your actions. But it's more of we're all in this together, and we all have the same level of professionalism here. So venues that you work with, you need to verify that they have their own insurance. Otherwise, you could be holding the bag. You need to verify that anyone you subcontract, say you've got a second shooter situation, make sure that they have insurance. It's not necessarily that they don't have to. I mean, maybe it's someone that just knows how to use a camera and is a one-time thing. Just know that their actions are going to fall on your business insurance policy.
Wow.
So all the more reason why you need to have business insurance.
I would not have thought of that with having a second shooter.
As it's a subcontractor relationship.
Speaking about the venues, and I know a lot of venues now require the other vendors, like photographers, to have insurance before, like if it's a wedding, a lot of these venues are now requiring everyone to have insurance. And I think that's probably a pretty smart move on their part.
Right. But I have insured a couple of venues as well, and I'm giving them that advice. Anyone you have on site, make sure that they have insurance. But you would be surprised too how many venues don't have it together, don't require it at all. I don't want to name anyone specifically, but there's a very large, partially taxpayer funded venue in the Kanawha County area that does not require anyone to have any business insurance and has no conversations about it with them. And it's scary to me because it's anything goes in that situation. So if you're on site doing what you're supposed to be doing with your contracts, with your insurance, then you could potentially be brought into a liability claim because there's no clear division of responsibilities. That is why insurance companies and attorneys like to see written contracts, because a written contract divides the responsibilities. We're saying this part is what I'm responsible for, and this is where the line is, and this part is what you're responsible for. So that when something goes south over here, then my insurance and I are not responsible for that. That was on you to make sure that was set up properly, or make sure that light wasn't left out in the middle of the room, whatever. You were the one that was supposed to set up this. The setup is covered in your contract. So your insurance is responsible for it. Clear division. In a perfect world, that's how it would work. And so I also want to point out too, a lot of people are using ChatGPT and AI to make contracts for them. That's not a bad thing. But think of it as a starting point and actually read the full contract, because I have read contracts where they invalidate themselves from paragraph 1 to paragraph 3, and AI is not checking that the contract has continuity. I'm checking it and I'm like, did you read this? Because, this is supposed to be helping you to stay out of liability, but I'm reading that 1 and 3 contradict each other. And I'm just using my brain. I'm not an attorney, but I'm seeing that you're essentially holding this person harmless for everything and putting it all on you. That doesn't make sense. But the words sound great, but 1 and 3 don't match. Right. So make sure you're reading your contract for continuity if you're not at the point where you're using an attorney.
I want to go back a little bit to the venue situation, because I think a lot of photographers, especially those who are just starting out, they're just this little baby rookie photographer. And it's a little intimidating to, get one of your first gigs at this venue and, walk up to the owner and be like, hey, do you have insurance? Like what's a good way to handle that?
Yeah. How I would navigate that conversation, and this is some advice that I give my clients all the time, is make me the bad guy. Say, you know what? my insurance agent wanted me to ask you, I'm trying to make sure I've got all my boxes checked. Do you all have business insurance? And if so, would you mind to send me over some for my records? I just want to make sure I have it on file so I do everything the right way. And that really reflects well on you, I feel like, in your professionalism. And it's not you being arrogant and walking up and saying, I need to see proof of your insurance.
Right.
It's making your insurance agent the bad guy. And hey, I'll be your insurance agent for the day.
You under the bus.
Throw me under the bus. You say, this insurance agent that I listened to on a podcast, or my insurance agent, they wanted me to ask to make sure that you all also have business insurance. And they're used to providing this to people because they're being hired by, say, a wedding party or a guest, or working with an event planner or things like that, where they might be the host. So this is something that they should have on file to already be able to send out quickly. You don't want to ask them to name you as an additional insured on their policy, because the relationship goes the other way. They're usually asking you to name them as an additional insured on their policy because they're the host and you're coming on their site.
Right.
So that's the way that the relationship would flow, is almost like they're welcoming you. So they would be improper to say, can you name me as an additional insured? We need to do this for each other. That wouldn't go over very well. Right. But if they were able to provide you just a general evidence of insurance, or even if they say, yes, we have it, that's still better than you were before. Because if they don't have business insurance, that would be something, me personally, I would be uncomfortable going there with my insurance policy and me doing everything the legitimate way, because then I know if something happens that's completely unrelated to me, their customer over there choked on a prime rib, then most attorneys are going to attempt to sue everyone in the room, in my experience, and having contracts that clearly partition the liability. Like, I wasn't responsible for setting up the prime rib. Yes, I was there, but I was over here taking pictures. I wasn't cooking, helps to protect you from that situation and distance you.
And speaking of these contracts, would you recommend everyone having an attorney or someone in the legal space look over contracts beforehand?
Ideally, yes, but that is going to be potentially costly. Okay. So, and another cost-saving measure that you could potentially do is talking to, say, another photographer who has used an attorney, who has an attorney vet their contract, maybe asking to share or to buy the contract from them, or have a conversation like that, like have coffee with Kathleen, someone who you trust, who has used an attorney. Then you can benefit from that work as well and customize it with your own name and your own agreements and things like that. So like a photographer mentor. Okay. I've done that for other insurance agents when they're starting out and they need, some assistance. So if I have something that an attorney's looked over, then I'll provide that. So
yeah, I love that. And I always say, don't be afraid to ask. Yeah. I know it can be intimidating going up to someone, asking them, hey, can you be my mentor? Hey, can you share this with me? But on something this important, I think you just have to not be afraid.
Right.
Do it.
Right.
Yeah. So in addition to contracts, some other things that I personally do to kind of try to help avoid that claim in the first place. I do have backup systems in place. Like, we have backups to our backups. I know when I go out on a session and my camera personally has 2 memory cards per camera, your camera may not have that. If you are in the market for a new one, I do recommend looking into that. That way you have a backup on your camera. Whether you do or not, as soon as you take that camera home, make sure you put those photos on a hard drive. From the hard drive, put them on your computer. Once I edit them on my computer, I store them in multiple places. I'm always making sure I have backups. So I think that's important too, because that's one less thing they can come after you for if you lose the photos. Another thing I like to do is safety practices at sessions. And this was just kind of those things you learn along the way. We had a situation where smoke bombs were really popular a few years ago. They're not so much anymore. And a lot of photographers were having their clients hold the smoke bombs. Mm-hmm. And there was a situation where, fortunately, it wasn't the client. I was the one holding the smoke bomb, and it blew up in my hand. Fortunately, I still have all my digits, but, it caused injury, and it was scary. And I just kept thinking, if that was one of my clients, how horrible that could be. So, just think of things like that in advance. Don't have your client hold a smoke bomb.
Well, and that also is potential for fire. Like there was a claim actually that happened in California. I believe it was last year, was a gender reveal gone wrong during the California wildfires and things.
I do think I saw that.
Now that was a couple, not a photographer who was a part of that. Okay. So it was a couple filming their own gender reveal, but they were held liable for that, for a large fire that started. But if it's, if you're using specialized photography and you're not adding the flames afterwards, you're using it live, there's no insurance exclusion for that necessarily. Like you're allowed to have fire in most cases. Depends on the carrier. Some ask, some don't. But if you're doing pyro photography, definitely wouldn't let the clients hold that. But also if a fire starts, then you are absolutely held liable for that. And you need to please read the exclusions of your insurance policy, or have a commercial insurance agent read them with you. I am OCD about exclusions, and I will, if I think there's any part of the exclusions that could pertain to your business, I'm sending it to you in writing, and I'm making sure that you and I understand it. Drone photography is the thing now. Yes. And so if you're a photography generalist, but you also use a drone, you need to review your policy and make sure it doesn't exclude drone, because most of them do. There's a special insurance policy and a special carrier, several special carriers who will do drones. And not a lot of them will do it through commercial insurance agent. A lot of those are going direct. Oh, okay. So it's important to talk to a commercial insurance agent who knows that and either has markets for drones or can point you in the right place to get drone coverage, because that's a newer thing to make sure you're protected.
Okay, that's good to know, because a lot of photographers are looking into doing more work with drones. There's so many rules and regulations when it comes to drones. It's something we've never really seriously looked into. But...
Which is why I didn't point to the exclusions in your policy about it.
All right. Another thing that I would recommend is just like not overwhelming yourself, like not overbooking yourself, not working yourself to death, because when that happens, I think it's just easy to miss things. Yeah. Also, make sure you're having clear communication with your clients, have policies set in place, make sure they know in advance, what your policies are, just things like that I do to try to protect ourselves. Let's talk a little bit about like location permissions, and what you can tell us about that, because, there are certain places where a lot of photographers, this is kind of known, this is where we go. A lot of times it's public property, sometimes it's private property. What do we need to know as far as insurance goes on locations? And
Sure. So generally, insurance is going to exclude illegal activity, which, for instance, going on the railroad tracks is illegal.
Oh, yes. That's a big thing in photography.
Photography, portraits, but you're not supposed to play on the railroad tracks unless they're active railroad tracks. I don't know. I don't know what the law says exactly. If it's active railroad tracks or ones that have been retired, I don't know.
It's a huge debate in the photography world, and I'm not even going to touch on it because,
But for instance, your insurance is going to exclude an act if you're committing an illegal act on purpose. If you're shooting a picture or film of somebody robbing a bank, guess what? Your insurance is not going to pay. If you are filming someone or doing photography on railroad tracks, knowing that that's illegal, then your insurance is not going to pay. So as far as your location permissions, you want to make sure you have permission to be there, that you're not trespassing. Guess what? Trespassing is illegal. Or if it's a public space, you of course want to make sure you have the permission of the people who you're photographing. There was a whole concert not too long ago where people were high profile and they were visiting a concert, and the cameraman accidentally got them in the shot. Oh, yes. Now, technically, that cameraman wasn't breaking any laws. So my guess is if there's a lawsuit that's filed, that it's not going to go anywhere because he was randomizing people in the room. It'll just get thrown out. But that's an example. If you're filming in a facility where people have people like say you were taking pictures in Alcoholics Anonymous or something where people expect anonymity, and they're expecting confidentiality. If you're breaking confidentiality by photographing someone, maybe you don't know that they've not signed a form, if they're not in a public space and they haven't signed a form giving you permission to be the exception. I would tread very carefully about that when you're photographing someone, because that is an example of a professional liability claim potentially there. If you accidentally photograph someone who said, no, my kid's photo can't be on the internet, for instance, and they sue you. So make sure you have not just location permissions to be in a public space to be photographing, but also privacy permissions.
I think that's a good point you just mentioned with the children and putting their pictures on the internet. And that's something, one of those things that I just mentioned, one of those policies I have in place. When someone books a session with me, I have them fill out a questionnaire. And one of the questions is, are you okay with us sharing these photos on social media? Because a lot of people aren't. They don't want their children on social media. And I totally respect that. But it's good to know those things in advance. That way you don't even have to deal with the situation.
Right. Exactly. And everything that you can get in writing, get it in writing. Mm-hmm. Keep receipts for everything, as the youngins say, have everything filled out and make sure that you save the permissions, the contracts, the signatures, and have it backed up.
So hopefully all of that didn't scare you. I know there's a lot that goes into insurance. A lot of things could potentially go wrong, but that's why it's here and why it's so important to have it. And let's just talk a little bit again about getting started, because I feel like this may have overwhelmed some people. And I think the best place to start is just at the beginning. So a photographer who does not have insurance, what can they do today?
So the first thing they need to do is to take inventory of their supplies, what the values are, and what the serial numbers are. Keep it in an Excel spreadsheet or something. Keep your receipt of purchase. That's better than nothing. That proves what the value is of your equipment. They also need to make an estimate of what they are going to do annually for their annual revenues. So their gross annual revenue is what an insurance agent would ask. And payroll, if they've got any payroll, that would need that for workers' compensation. And that's really it to get started.
So really not that bad at all. It seems like it could be very overwhelming, but it's pretty simple to get started.
It is.
What advice do you have for any photographer out there as far as insurance goes? I mean, I know you just gave a whole slew of it, but what is like the most important piece you really want people to grasp?
Well, I want people to remember that insurance evolves, and also insurance is reactive, not proactive. So creative people come up with creative, awesome ideas, but there may not be an insurance policy developed yet to cover that risk. So it's important that you have an open conversation with an experienced insurance agent who can maybe design something between 2 or 3 different insurance carriers if need be, to string together the coverages that you need if you're coming up with an out-of-the-box idea that nobody's done before. Like a selfie studio was a new thing for me, but I knew photography. And so I had to make sure that we had the right coverages in place to make sure that Kathleen was protected. But remember that insurance is ever-changing and it reacts to the creative space. And so if you're doing anything different, if you haven't had your insurance policy reviewed in a while, maybe your business operations have changed, then it's important to revisit that.
I mean, every time something changes in our business, no matter how small, I am messaging Danielle, like, do I need to change anything? And actually, I think we're probably going to have a conversation about that today after this. But anything else you want people to know before we head out?
I think we covered it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for shedding light on some very challenging concepts for a lot of people who have never really looked into it. I really appreciate you being here. And of course, for insuring me. If anyone else wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
They can give me a call or text me at our office number. It's 304-984-3004, or email me, Danielle@insurewithellis.com. And feel free to connect with us on social media. We're on, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. We like to make funny videos, but not as cool as her husband's.
Oh, no, I love your videos. And I'll put the links to all of that in the show notes so you can check them out. All right. Thank you so much. And I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to Off the Memory Card. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you'd like some more support on your photography journey, head over to usethatcamera.com.